Steven Universe, a cartoon produced by Rebecca Sugar and which aired on Cartoon Network from 2013 until 2020, follows the exploits of a group of anthropomorphized extraterrestrial gemstones, called the Crystal Gems, and their half-human, half-gem hybrid ward, the titular Steven Universe. If you aren't familiar with the series, the first season and a bit is a loosely connected group of stories centered on Steven's adventures as a crystal gem, interspersed with Steven interacting with the residents of the town he lives in, Beach City. While the elements of a more cohesive, overarching narrative are present, it isn't until a few episodes into the second season that the show begins to develop into a more tightly knit, plot-driven story about Steven growing into the void left by the absence of his mother, the former leader of the Crystal Gems, Rose Quartz. I provide this very brief overview so that you have the barest of context, well, those of you who may not be familiar with the plot of the series, so that you're not going to be going in totally blind when I start to reference things throughout this piece. As I have already mentioned, one of the core story beats that permeates the series is Steven learning how to develop and control his powers. This means that Steven spends at least some time engaged in that favorite pastime of every shonen protagonist since Shonen Jump began publishing in the 1950s, training. I will not be going into the much broader topic of training as a central narrative element in visual media series aimed at preteens and teenagers. Instead, this piece will focus on one particular manifestation of this element, learning how to use a sword. While just about anyone can understand the value in learning how to engage in unarmed self-defense or even hand-to-hand combat, sword fighting is characterized first and foremost as an anachronism. People no longer routinely wear swords as they go about their day-to-day lives after all, and so swords, and their use as tools of self-defense and combat, will not be a weapon that the vast majority of the target audience will have any practical experience with. Swords and sword arts are therefore experienced primarily as fiction, as the stuff of high fantasy and space opera. Understanding how swords are used and what pedagogy was developed to teach their use as effective weapons are also experienced in the context of fiction. It is this aspect of popular culture which has brought us here, and so we return now to Steven Universe. Part 1. Season 1, Episode 16. Steven the Sword Fighter. Steven, after watching the latest episode of one of his favorite television shows, The Lonely Blade, becomes excited after Pearl, the crystal gem most overtly responsible for teaching Steven about gem culture, offers to teach him how to use a sword. His initial enthusiasm is dulled, however, once he learns about the tedium involved in repetitive motion drills and learning how to properly stand. His boredom turns to terror, however, once the holographic training simulation, Holo Pearl, stabs the real Pearl, causing her to poof. It is noteworthy that this is the first time in the series that the audience witnesses a crystal gem being poofed, and that the normal forms of the gems are in fact hard light projections emanating from their individual core gemstone. As time passes, and as Pearl doesn't regenerate right away, Steven tries to replace her in his day-to-day life with Holo Pearl. He inadvertently activates her advanced combat mode, but Steven utilizes what he has been taught by Pearl to deactivate the Renegade training hologram. Pearl eventually regains her form, and Steven is happy at her return, but never again trains with a sword. Part 2. The Impertinence of Youth. One of the aspects of this episode that I really enjoy, and something I'm sure many martial artists can appreciate, is the accurate representation of the tedium that can be involved in training. Most of us, those of us who are not the children or relatives of martial arts instructors or enthusiasts, will experience martial arts initially through the consumption of highly stylized visual media. This excitement will naturally lead, for those of us with families that could afford it anyway, to seeking out instruction in a given martial art of our choosing, or whichever is offered locally and cheaply. This initial enthusiasm quickly runs up against the reality of the physical conditioning and repetitive drills that form most core, traditional, and even modern martial art training. It is this point which is typically where you as a novice make the decision to press on and see where this leads, or you abandon the pursuit for another pastime. This is doubly true for approaching sword-based martial arts, because while heavily stylized representations of unarmed combat in visual media have relative degrees of fantasy built in, this tendency goes into overdrive when it comes to the presentation of sword-based combat. Steve's entire understanding of sword-based combat stems from his enjoyment of the fictional television series The Lonely Blade, and when he learns that he will not be spending his time mastering techniques like the boomerang blade, but rather learning how to properly stand, his enthusiasm dries up. This is refreshing since so many Western cartoons and shonen battle manga readily take it for granted that the process of learning how to fight with weapons is this constantly exciting and transformative process. Tedium is bypassed through the prolific use of montage, so the audience gets to see the grueling ordeal at 3 times speed and instantaneous payoff. The lived experience is anything but. Now, a proviso is probably in order lest you think I have some aversion to the very content of this channel, because, truth be told, I really do enjoy drilling. I have spent the vast majority of my time as a HEMA practitioner. For those of you who don't know, HEMA is Historical European Martial Arts, and to a lesser extent, doing pair drills. The thrill of sparring and pressure testing techniques is real and is a remarkable source of motivation, but I'm often not able to get up to the salle as often as I would like, and it is solo drilling which has maintained my commitment to the continued practice of sword arts. With that said, I also recognize that for many, and especially the young and enthusiastic, this isn't what they signed up for. But let's look at another episode and what can happen when you have a more enthusiastic pupil. Part 3. Season 2, Episode 6, Sworn to the Sword. After Connie helps Stephen fend off some overly aggressive seagulls, she remarks how much she would like to learn sword fighting for real. Stephen tells Connie that he just so happens to know someone who can make that happen. Pearl is reluctant at first, but is won over when she sees herself reflected in Connie's determination to grow to help Stephen. Pearl explains how she has modeled her own identity on the knight, and that Connie should do likewise. But Connie is an apt pupil, and it isn't long until she's coming over to train instead of chilling with Stephen. When Stephen begins to worry about Connie becoming obsessed with sword fighting, he relays his concern to the other crystal gems, Garnet and Amethyst. Garnet explains that during the Gem War, Pearl would thoughtlessly put herself in danger to protect Rose, and Stephen imagines Connie doing the same thing. Stephen rushes to the training arena, confronts Connie, and explains he wants to fight with her as a team. Pearl is upset that the training has been interrupted and loses her cool when confronted by the pair, accidentally calling Stephen Rose in her anger. They work it out though, and Pearl regains her enthusiasm when Stephen informs her that both he and Connie will continue to train, but as a team. Part 4. Sword Nerd. I have a confession. Not that I'm someone of any significance, but do you want to know a secret? When I sat down to brainstorm what I was going to call, well, whatever this is, the channel, I suppose, the initial channel or series title that sprung to my mind was Sworn to the Sword. The title just so succinctly encapsulates the sort of quasi-mythic, fully romantic ideal of swordsmanship, and the sword itself as a cultural object, but also the idea that it was not just the stuff of fantasy, but a worthwhile pursuit in its own right. Discovering HEMA really did get me back into both martial arts, something I was invested in when I was a teenager, but also academic pursuits, returning to the study of history in a much more in-depth way, but also being introduced to the growing field of martial arts studies. One of the core narrative beats of the character of Pearl is that she made a decision to reject the function of her class, something which had been predestined since before her creation. In Gem Society, at least during Phase 1 and Phase 2, pearls were the living accessories of the highest ranked and most important gems. They were personal attendants, whose personalities were literally formatted to reflect the character of their owners. Graceful and delicate, servile and diminutive, just about the furthest function in Gem Society one could get from a soldier. Yet, Pearl's defining trait, her raison d'etre, was to reject the literal reason she was made, and live for herself, and she did this by learning how to use a sword. Thus, not only does Pearl understand the transformative power of learning a martial art, but she is enthusiastic about passing on her knowledge to others. In this case, Stephen's best friend, Connie Maheshwaran. Connie is a normal human preteen, whose parents have her on the path of overachieving academic. She has led a normal, if sheltered and hyper-structured life. That is until she meets Stephen and is gradually pulled into his world. Connie, like Stephen, and probably most adolescents, expresses an interest in learning how to sword fight, and jumps at the opportunity when it becomes presented to her. This is where the difference in personality comes to the fore, because unlike Stephen's almost immediate tedium, Connie takes to Pearl's training like a fish to water. Not only is Connie a quick study, but also an excellent and enthusiastic student. We work through the typical training montage and see Connie develop into a competent sword fighter in no time at all. Pearl's pedagogy is quite traditional, starting off with how to properly stand, learning how to effectively move, how to maintain concentration, and so on. This moves to paired drills, pressure testing, and finally sparring. While the basics shown in the episode are reflective of some modern one-handed sword systems, the flips and such like are par for the course for fictionalized sword fighting. This is fine. Fidelity to extant authentic sword systems are not necessary to enjoy fictionalized representations of sword-based combat. Where the episode becomes interesting, and the central conflict of the narrative, is that aside from growing into a competent swordswoman, Connie also absorbs Pearl's underlying ideology. This too is an important element of the way sword arts, and martial arts in a more generalized sense, are reproduced in fiction, and as it turns out, in the real world. Part 5. First, you must fill your head with knowledge. Then you can hit ice with it. Let me ask you a question. How many philosophical treatises have you read? Of those, how many were specifically about combat? While some texts are going to have greater purchase and influence dependent upon your own background and interests, others will have been so thoroughly mainstreamed that exposure to at least some of the principles or philosophical arguments had become the very basic framework of the discourse itself. This discourse is reproduced in the media that we consume, and therefore, any familiarity you have with a text like The Art of War will owe to having been exposed to one of its many precepts in some media property, rather than through reading any of the 100 or so available translations that are out there. You are exposed to it passively, rather than actively seeking it out. In a similar fashion, for those who practice traditional martial arts, there is often a significant amount of stress placed on the philosophical or even spiritual underpinnings of the art you are learning. Structures of etiquette, mindset, and philosophy are held to be as vital as learning how to properly grip a sword or stand correctly. Now, I'm stressing traditional martial arts, but the inverse is also true. Contemporary combat sports absolutely contain and propagate an ideology that is inherent in their pedagogies, and so represents a continuum as these systems and schools reproduce themselves. Ironically, perhaps, the assumed philosophical and/or spiritual rootedness of traditional martial arts, especially specific arts from East Asia, are themselves modern constructs. For now, I'm going to leave this hanging, as it is well beyond the scope of this video, but my intention is to produce more content that will explore this claim in the not-too-distant future. I mention all of this to develop a little context for the central question of, where do our values come from? Well, that's actually not a particularly helpful question, given the focus of this video. Rather, let me rephrase. Where does our understanding of what it means to be a warrior come from? Most of the people watching this video will not be engaged in occupations where combat is their primary function. Even those that have an overtly martial component, soldier, police constable, security guard, etc., well, supposedly, ideally, is perhaps more reflective of reality, only resort to combat as a last resort, once all other options of de-escalation have been exhausted. As such, first-hand experience of martial profession is not widespread enough to establish any sort of cultural ethos. Once more, we turn to media and fictionalized representations. Getting back to the topic at hand, you can now perhaps understand a little better why I argue that most people experience combat built around the use of swords through these fictionalized depictions. In the same manner, the philosophy which has come to popularly underlie these fictive sword fighters is experienced and reproduced in the same way. We know what it means to be a knight, not because we have an exhaustive knowledge of medieval culture or history, but because we experience a set of associated values enacted through characters in the popular media that we consume. Part 6. Do It For Him. As the main story of Steven Universe progresses, we begin to learn more about Pearl's backstory. As I mentioned earlier, that her self-idealization as an independent gem is based primarily off the figure of the European knight. This is neither the first nor the last time it comes up in the narrative. As I've said, it is one of the defining characteristics of Pearl's self-identity. But this is the first time she sings about it, and songs are a big deal in Steven Universe. The song, Do It For Him, is the first time in the series a character's entire ethos is laid bare, and it is done very succinctly, as the song is only a few minutes long. This song encapsulates Pearl's identity as a loyal retainer of Rose Quartz, and what that means to her, a life dedicated to duty and sacrifice. Through the song, we begin to understand that while Pearl herself is completely convinced of her own agency, that she had in reality simply substituted her original diminutive servitude for abnegation through combat. Despite the fact that Pearl was literally dwarfed by the gems who were created for war, she never let that get in the way of performing her self-sworn duty to protect Rose at any cost. Did she ever take time to consider that Rose didn't actually need her protection? Does she now realize that because of the differences in gem and human physiology, this ethos of self-sacrifice will have a significantly greater impact on Connie, who will not just poof when fatally injured? The answer to both questions is no, but thankfully, Connie has internalized Pearl's philosophy, so she doesn't actually seem all that concerned about dying. As it turns out, what got Connie over the hump, so to speak, what motivated her to push through the tedium and pain, was precisely this romantic image that Pearl had created of herself. Connie's usual intellectual approach to problem solving had been overwhelmed by Pearl's instruction and ethos of living solely for the benefit of someone else. We as an audience also understand what this means, how this image reinforces our own notions of the ethos of ancient warriors, what it must have been like to live by the codes of chivalry or bushido, of what it means to be a warrior. Steven, the object of Connie's devotion, is initially enthusiastic about the idea of Connie pursuing practical combat training. He's very supportive, even when Connie begins to ignore him, even when he sees the physical toll the training is having on her. But this begins to shift, this support, when he starts to realize that Connie's relationship with him is also changing, as it turns out, for the worse. During the sequence of Do It For Him, Steven becomes increasingly uncomfortable, and while Connie continues to train with Pearl, he seeks out the advice of the other crystal gems. Part 7. The romantic runs up against reality. After a brief discussion with the leader of the crystal gems, Garnet, Steven learns just how divergent Pearl's memories of the past are from her idealized nostalgia. As it turns out, Pearl continuously placed herself in harm's way, often getting poofed in the process, regardless of whether Rose herself was in peril. Pearl's actions were those not of a competent, loyal retainer, but of a fanatic zealot. At least this is the implication of these revelations. The tone of the series and the sympathy directed towards Pearl does soften what ought to be an acerbic critique. It changes it, shifts it, you might say, to a deep-rooted character flaw that will only become more important as the series progresses. Fortunately, Connie is not Pearl. It takes little more than Steven to plead with her and explain that he wants to fight alongside and not behind Connie, to have the idealism wiped from her eyes as she is pulled back from the precipice of Pearl's ethos of abnegation. If only parsing out the romantic from the historic was so easy for us. I mean, it is relatively easy. It just takes some effort and study of both period sources and historic monographs to see how much of what is popularly portrayed as historic warrior ethics are products of the 19th and 20th centuries. Disseminating this information, however, is more difficult. And one of the most significant barriers is that a lot of what is represented in popular media, and specifically how this reproduces existing ideologies in the audiences themselves, is incredibly pervasive. Anyone with little critical thinking and perhaps a practical demonstration or two can understand why acrobatic maneuvers would be a foolish feat to perform while engaged in combat with a sword. The romantic image of the sword fighter is just as problematic as the depiction of acrobatic swordplay, but it is considerably more difficult to be aware of, let alone critique, a culturally enforced ethic which has been grafted onto an identity promoted primarily through fiction. Sure, the audience may scoff at an overly heroic swordswoman, ready to sacrifice her all for her liege lord, as too cliché, as a trope, but the ideology which is assumed to have undergirded that sentiment historically? This reluctance is understandable, because it is precisely that ideology which ennobles the swordsman as a figure in the wider culture. That ideology is why they are esteemed and valued, why they were worthy to carry the sword. The skills are important. The athleticism and the physicality required to engage in sword-based combat matter. But without that spark, without that special drive which provides the motivation, we cannot distinguish between the NPC and the player, so to speak. The messaging is clear. The spirit that animates the flesh will always be greater than the flesh alone. So, to conclude, I want to talk about the significance of both Stephen the Swordfighter and Sworn to the Sword in our analysis about what Steven Universe can teach us about sword fighting. Each presents a limited critique which is tied to the broader plot and character arcs of the major protagonists. Beyond this, however, is where we can see the reproduction of existing ideologies about what it means to be a sword fighter, or more broadly, a warrior, and how this image is reinforced. For narrative purposes, Stephen needs to learn that fictional combat does not translate into real combat, and Connie needs to learn that she doesn't need to erase her identity to help Stephen. The general assumption, the presentation of the ideology of the sword fighter, remain there for the audience to recognize, absorb, and, fundamentally, agree with. Stephen's naive, idealized swordsman isn't actually changed by the rigors of learning a martial art. He just accepts that sword fighting isn't for him. Connie doesn't abandon the role as Stephen's knight, she just accepts the offer of a horizontal relationship as co-equals. Pearl's idealism may have been fatally misplaced, but the fault is shown not to lie with the ideology of self-sacrifice, but in executing it poorly. A mistake of execution, not intent. We still emerge from these experiences with the idea of the romantic sword fighter very much unscathed. Further, that any such criticism lies squarely at the feet of those who fail to meet this standard, or who have corrupted the true essence of what it means to be a swordsman. With this video, my hope is that I have demonstrated that by examining even a few select episodes from a popular children's cartoon, much can be revealed about the way audiences interpret and internalize fictionalized representations of sword-based combat. How this process of exposure not only creates the only meaningful experience of sword arts the vast majority of people will have, but also reinforces and feeds into any pre-existing understanding of these arts and the philosophies which are believed to animate them. As I alluded to earlier, this is just the first step into a much larger project of examining not only swords and sword arts through the medium of visual media, but also the philosophies and beliefs which have, in many ways, survived and surpassed the associations with swords and sword arts that made them relevant in the first place. I hope you found this video interesting, and I invite your feedback in the comments below. Please like and share the video if you think it is merited, and if my ham-fisted attempts at foreshadowing future content has piqued your interest, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your time.